Today we're going to be looking at another one of Cleo Abram's videos, specifically the big lie about nuclear waste. There is certainly a lot of lies out there about that. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tyler Folse. I'm a nuclear engineer with a little over 10 years of experience in the commercial nuclear power industry. From engineering to operations to emergency response. I don't claim to know everything there is nuclear, but I can certainly share some knowledge. Let's check this out.
Nuclear power.
Nuclear power.
Nuclear power.
Nuclear waste.
Nuclear waste.
Nuclear waste.
Okay, I need to show you
Love the inclusion of Ron Swanson.
something. This is a nuclear reactor built in 1962.
The atomic power plant of the future.
Being developed by Argon National Laboratory.
But it's not just any old nuclear reactor.
This reactor is different in many ways from the nuclear power plants that supply some of our homes today with electricity.
The biggest difference was the fuel they used to make electricity. This nuclear reactor made electricity out of nuclear waste.
Nuclear waste.
Yes, it is reusable, and certain types of reactor designs, such as the can-do reactor, for instance, used in Canada, and that's because it uses heavy water, which is better at sustaining fission reactions, so you can use a less concentration of uranium-235 to still make a sustainable fission reaction. In other words, what is waste in one reactor design is not necessarily waste in a different reactor design.
Nuclear waste. Some kind of nuclear waste.
Well, sir, where should we dump that?
All the nasty green stuff.
Dispatch.
Do not
When I
eat.
think of nuclear waste, I think of that classic glowing green goo in yellow barrels, you know? This radioactive stuff that we
That is what most people think about. I think one of my very first videos I brought up, and you hardly ever see green goo, or even yellow barrels for that matter. And even still, the yellow barrels aren't the highest level waste.
end up with after all of the fuel is used up, that we have to store for hundreds of thousands of years because it's so dangerous.
Like, we fight about nuclear waste all the time. We say, well,
That's another myth. It's still going to be dangerous after hundreds of thousands of years. No, it'll be higher than background, but not dangerous.
can we even use nuclear because we end up with this radioactive waste, and where should we store it, and not near my house? And you're telling me that there's a nuclear reactor that can make electricity out of nuclear waste, and it was built in the 1960s? Back then, they were predicting that we would use this technology to build this incredible clean energy future.
It really is kind of sad, because back then, nuclear was thought of to have so much potential, and it really still does. It's just people got in the way of it.
And by the year 2000, more than half the electric power of the country will come from atomic sources.
Man, oh, that's breaking my heart. It really is.
But today, we're nowhere close to that. We don't reuse any of our nuclear waste. Instead, it just piles up. But if this technology works, that means that our nuclear waste isn't radioactive trash. It's an incredible clean energy resource. And it's just sitting there sucking up money to keep it safe. We think about technology as constantly moving forward. But this is a story about how we left behind a technology that could change our energy future.
Yeah. You could argue it's a nuclear dark age. When I clicked on this video, I actually wasn't sure what side she would be on. I'm glad she's optimistically on the side that we should continue to use nuclear power and continue the development of nuclear technology, better reactor design, getting more utilization out of our fuel.
So, this video is about what happened to using nuclear waste to make electricity, to the clean energy future that we could have had. But more importantly, this video is about the people trying to bring that future back.
Nuclear waste.
Nuclear waste problem.
The concern about nuclear energy.
There are concerns about emissions.
Abundant power. We need.
But what about emissions? I mean, and you're showing cooling towers. They went through it kind of fast, but some of those most hyperbolic cooling towers I've actually seen aren't from nuclear power plants. Coal power plants, combined cycle plants use those. In fact, the nuclear power plant I worked at didn't even have cooling towers. It just used a really big reservoir.
Clean energy.
Energizes the city. We are coming up with new nuclear reactors
That will guarantee a plentiful supply of atomic power for the nation and the world for centuries to come. Come.
Huge if true. Well, nuclear power can absolutely do that. Just people got in the way themselves.
I first got obsessed with this topic because a couple of weeks ago, my friend and fellow video journalist Johnny Harris called me up and he asked me for some help on a video that he was making all about nuclear power.
Let's do this. I'm going to go down the rabbit hole on why people are afraid of nuclear energy. What are the events and the things that freak us all out? And I kind of want you to do the opposite. To look at, like, is there a future for this technology, and should we actually be as afraid as we are?
So I started to dig into it. And as part of my research process into nuclear power, I got invited to go visit one of the largest and oldest national research centers in the United States.
Here we are. This is Argon National Laboratory.
That's nice. You can just get invited to those sort of places.
I get to go see the research that they're doing, and they have been doing research on nuclear power since, like, before I was born.
Hold on. Do you recognize that name?
Argon National Laboratory.
Yeah, this was the same national lab that developed that incredible old nuclear waste recycling reactor. But I didn't know that yet. So we go on this incredible tour. It's awesome. I'm learning a ton. I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm going to be so overprepared to talk to Johnny about nuclear power. And on this tour with me are these two people from Cleo, which is a company that's working on new kinds of nuclear reactors. And at the end of the tour, I'm sitting with them under this big tree. And one of them says something that just short circuits my brain.
So we're actually working with Argon closely on how to recycle existing nuclear waste in the US. There's enough used fuel to power the country for the next 150 years.
There is. The problem is it's expensive, and not just cost-wise, but in terms of convincing the right people. That latter bit's probably worse in terms of reprocessing, recycling, and not to mention building all of the nuclear power plants to provide energy for the US for the next 150 years. One of the fastest ways would probably be build CANDU reactors, or some other type of heavy water design reactor to just use essentially the waste without reprocessing, without having to bother recycling. Because I mean, in that case, you're just building the power plants rather than a reprocessing facility. But that's still going to be expensive, using a technology that's well developed in Canada, but never really took off in the US for some reason, even though they're neighbors. So you can argue if it's more expensive to build a different type of reactor design, or to use similar types of reactor design, but to make a reprocessing facility. That's your trade-off.
Wait, I'm sorry, what? There is enough used fuel in the country, in the US alone, to generate power for the country for the next 150 years.
So generate power for the country for the next 150 years, and that is not an exaggeration. In fact, I'm going to take it a step further. If as a civilization we go super hard on nuclear and recycle nuclear waste, invest in breeder reactors, mine seawater uranium and thorium, then nuclear power could power all of humanity, using the wild assumption that you can electrify everything until the sun consumes the Earth 5 billion years from now. Now that would be a crazy series of projects, but that is how much potential there really is. And none of that involves fusion.
Enough used fuel, meaning nuclear waste, in the US to power the country for 150 years. Like, you can see me not believing her. I think it's some fake math. Like, maybe technically there's enough energy there, but like we could never really use it. We don't know how to do that.
Whereas like when they say, geothermal, you could power the Earth for like thousands of years if we could get all of the energy out of the Earth. It's like, yeah, we can't, we don't know how to do that. Do we know how to?
Yeah, we just don't have the facility, commercial facility.
She's right. Now, there might be some intermittent steps we don't know how to do, but we know over 95% of it. The bits that we don't know, it's more of things that we forgot. Like how to engineer certain types of pressure vessels. Some of those have been outsourced and offshored. We're talking about the US specifically now. And a lot of people don't know as much about just large construction projects on this scales. Also how to reprocess. There are generational gaps, multi-generational gaps of lost knowledge. But as far as the technical problems, that's the remaining 5%. Isn't stuff we've never done before. It's more of stuff we forgot.
Do so, but the technology's there.
Experts differ on the exact number of years here, but they agree that the nuclear waste we have now could...
Sure, I know they were going with a wild thing. I mean, it could be 100, could be 200. but I get the gist of it.
It could be used as a large energy source based on technology that we've already built. But it gets even better. If you reuse that nuclear waste, especially if you reuse it more than once, you can dramatically cut down on the amount of time that the waste after all of that's done is radioactive.
Now, reusing it more than once, you do get diminishing returns, just like any sort of recycling, but I'm thinking that, the 100 to 200 year figure, that is from reusing. Heavy water designs and breeder designs can extend that into the thousands of years even.
Active for. So the amount of time that we have to store our nuclear waste. The problems are cost and global politics, not fundamental technology. Here we go.
And part of that cost is, I'm just trying to think back to what was said earlier in this video. If nuclear power had continued to grow the way it did in the 1960s and the 1970s, it wouldn't be as expensive for two reasons. One, we haven't forgotten how to do it. There's no knowledge gap anymore. And two, if you're producing 50% of your energy from nuclear, it's going to be economical to recycle. That's why France recycles and the US doesn't. Check out this video if you'd like to know more details. I'll pin the link down below.
By the time I got to DC to talk to Johnny about this, I was obsessed.
Hello, good morning.
Welcome to our studio.
We have all of this nuclear waste, right? And it is scary. But imagine that there was a way that you could actually not just store it, but actually use it.
So you can use nuclear waste as fuel for more energy.
You can recycle nuclear waste.
You can recycle nuclear waste.
Yes. And I dived all the way into this in a video that I'm now going to promise is going to be on my channel by the time we air this one.
This is that video. To understand what's going on here, you have to understand that nuclear waste isn't what you've been told. Let's zoom out for a sec. Basically, all of the electricity that you use, except solar, comes from spinning a turbine.
It's magic.
Most of the time inside of
Another example is a different way of making electricity using nuclear power, using something called a radioisotope thermoelectric generator. You get electricity just from radioactive decay. It's not very much, but it lasts a very long time. So it's used on things like space probes and remote weather monitoring equipment in the Arctic. Requires no maintenance for decades or even centuries, but it doesn't generate that much electricity.
power plant, what you're really doing is you're heating up a liquid into steam and using that to spin the turbine. The most common way to do that is still burning stuff near it.
This is the first one of these infographics where I see the boiler on the right side and the generator on the left side. It's kind of funny. I guess most people are used to just one convention.
Fossil fuels. But you could also use liquid that the Earth already heated up for you. That's geothermal. Or
like
you can split atoms apart inside special rocks and make them really hot. That's nuclear. And
I love the simplicity of that, because all it is just boiling water. Hot rocks make steam, spin a roundy thing to generate zappy.
Special hot rocks are uranium.
Uranium-235. Uranium. Sleep. Uranium fever.
But only a really small part of natural uranium, less than 1%, is a kind of breakable uranium that can sustain a nuclear reaction. This is uranium-235.
In most cases, CANDU reactors use natural uranium. The trade-off is they have to make heavy water.
The number refers to the number of neutrons in the atom. So typically uranium goes through a process called enrichment, which is making more of the uranium-235 out of the less useful uranium-238. By the time that's all done,
if only it was that simple. At the plant I worked with, we had 3 to 5% enriched uranium. It's not uniform though, and that's because you need to strategically place each fuel assembly throughout the reactor to optimize your heat distribution. I suppose theoretically you could make a spherical reactor with uniform heat distribution and uniform enrichment, but it's not practical.
Your fuel looks like this. If you take your finger up to your first joint, that's about the size of a uranium fuel pellet. Those pellets then go into these long...
And one of those teeny tiny fuel pellets gives you more energy than a ton of coal. And that's if you don't recycle it or breed it. If you breed it, it's worth over 20 tons of coal.
Metal rods that I got to see while I was at Argon. And then comes the nuclear reaction. So you fire a bunch of free atoms at your uranium-235, which cracks it into smaller, very unstable atoms, and throws off a couple other neutrons in the process, which zoom off and hit more uranium nearby, and then more and more, a chain reaction of splitting atoms.
So for uranium-235, on average, you'll get between 2 and 3 neutrons per fission, which is why it keeps going.
And each time they get split, a little mass turns into energy, which makes the rods really hot, which heats the water, which spins the turbine, which generates electricity. Ta-da! But eventually, after 4 to 6 years, you've broken enough of that special uranium that the reaction stops working efficiently. And that spent fuel is now considered high-level nuclear waste.
So you don't put it in there for 4 to 6 years straight. You have to, a typical refueling cycle is 18 to 24 months, but you do put the same assemblies back in. You have fresh fuel once burn and twice burn, at least at the plant that I worked at. But the overall time is on the order of 4 to 6 years.
At this point, that waste is a mix of 238 and a little bit of leftover 235 and a bunch of very unstable atoms that give off ionizing radiation. That ionizing radiation in large doses is the bad stuff. It's the scary, invisible killer that affects our tissues and our DNA in often deadly ways.
Nuclear waste, the transuranic waste, can produce quite a bit of ionizing radiation, but don't take that just because something is ionizing, it's dangerous. It all depends on orders of magnitude and how you come into contact with it. Obviously, if you eat the stuff, the amount of dose you're going to get is far worse than if you touch the stuff.
And the thing is, this nuclear waste stays radioactive for an insanely long time. We're talking hundreds of thousands of years sometimes, which is, to put it mildly, a problem.
So this graph is correct, but it's an exponential graph, and that 100,000 years, the amount of radioactivity now, 100,000 years compared to a few decades to centuries, is way, way less. And this is an exponential graph. Some of the nastiest isotopes are cesium-137 and strontium-90. Those are the big hazards those are probably the biggest hazards with the Chernobyl exclusion zone today, which the Chernobyl exclusion zone is another thing that people have exaggerated how dangerous it is now. That's a separate topic. Strontium-90 and cesium-137 have a half-life of about 30 years. And most radiation protection experts agree that between 7 and 10 half-lives, it's gone. So we're talking a few centuries rather than hundreds of millennia as far as it being dangerous. Now, it will still be higher than background, but it might as well not be considered the same substance anymore.
We've got to find better and safer ways to store nuclear waste.
Waste that can remain radioactive for centuries, that remains a big problem.
Right now, most nuclear waste in the United States is stored in dry casks that look like this to protect people from the radiation.
These things can withstand severe weather and even direct hits with missiles. And the license for the dry cask pad at the plant I worked at extended through 2100. And that doesn't mean it suddenly becomes dangerous in 2100. It just means it will need to be reevaluated. But these dry casks are quite safe. I agree we need a longer-term solution, especially after the failure of Yucca Mountain, which, by the way, the U.S. Department of Energy does provide credits to nuclear power plants that use dry cask storage as compensation for breaking the promise of Yucca Mountain or any other long-term repository in the U.S.
Active material inside. Those dry casks are meant to last decades, but not hundreds of thousands of years, which is what we're talking about here.
You wouldn't need something like that for hundreds of thousands of years. The amount of protection you would need hundreds of thousands of years from now isn't nearly as much as shown by this previous graph in this video.
So we've been having this ongoing fight for decades about what to do with nuclear waste. There are options for long-term storage, and some countries are already doing that. Johnny and I got into the details in his video. But right now, in the US and in lots of other countries, there are a lot of dry casks full of nuclear waste just sitting there at nuclear power plants. So to summarize, we take uranium out of the ground, we use it once, and then we store it basically forever. This is the once-through fuel cycle that the US has today. Now listen to the analogy that they used in the 1960s to describe how stupid this fuel cycle would be.
Would you say that using the 235 and not the rest is sort of like using the cream and throwing away the milk?
Exactly.
The key is to figure out how to filter out the stuff that's still useful from the real waste that's not. Turns out Argonne is one of the few places that is still testing nuclear waste recycling in the US, and I got to go see it.
I'm just gonna go right on up, and they're gonna tell me to stop filming right now.
It was a whole thing. I had to send them my passport to prove that I was a US citizen before they'd let me on the tour, and
it took me 4 weeks working at the nuclear power plant before they would even let me inside the fence that surrounds the nuclear power plant. When I first started working, they take this stuff very seriously. I'm actually surprised she was able to make a video at all about this.
I wasn't allowed to film inside. In order to go into this place that I can't show you, I have to wear these cool safety glasses. How do I look? Amazing. Let's do it.
Safety glasses are important in any laboratory or plant setting.
Luckily, Argonne itself has actually published footage from the lab that I toured, so here's what they're doing inside that large protective box. First, they cut up the nuclear waste into little pieces. Then they dissolve those pieces into a vat of molten salts. When they run electricity through that vat, it separates the uranium and other useful materials from the rest of the junk and pushes it across the vat, where it creates deposits of the useful stuff on the other side. Then they make new fuel rods out of those deposits and stick them back in a reactor. And it's not just possible to do that once, you can do it multiple times, not just making electricity, but also reducing how long that waste is radioactive for.
Relative radiotoxicity. Now that is a weird term that doesn't come up very much, and you can see here it's just a ratio. It takes into account multiple factors. One is the type of radiation, like alpha particles. Most of them won't penetrate your skin, but if they're taken internally, are 20 times worse than beta or gamma radiation. And then gamma radiation, which are difficult to block, requiring upwards of 8 inches of lead to attenuate, but proportionally don't do as much internal damage. Another thing is the half-life. And you might think longer half-life means worse, but actually, shorter half-life means it's going to decay faster. It's going to emit a lot of its radioactive material faster. So if you ingest something with a short half-life, it's going to do way more damage to you than a comparable substance with a longer half-life. Another thing is the biological impact. Iodine-131 is notorious because it accumulates in the thyroid and can cause localized organ damage, which is why after an accident, the emergency director can authorize the use of potassium iodine tablets to mitigate that. And finally, overall exposure time. Cut your time around the radioactive material, you cut the overall harmful effect. So radiotoxicity is a weighted function of all 4 of those things.
Because you're using up the materials that last the longest, from hundreds of thousands of years down sometimes to hundreds of years, which is a much easier time frame to store something.
And yep, that 200 years plus comes directly from cesium and strontium, and a few other transuranics.
If you can pull this off, you can have a nuclear fuel cycle that looks like this. You mine the uranium, you use it in a reactor, filter out the useful stuff, then you use it again, and maybe again, and again. And when you can't anymore, then you put it in much shorter term storage that's much more manageable. This is called a closed fuel cycle, and there are lots of variations. But it's not hypothetical. Some countries, like Japan for example, are already doing this. And they say they do it because it reduces their dependence on imported fuel, it conserves uranium, and it reduces the radioactivity of their nuclear waste.
Yeah.
Which makes sense.
Great reasons.
So, what happened in the United States?
Tonight I want to have an unpleasant talk with you.
In 1977, President Jimmy Carter announced new policies meant to stop the growing risk of nuclear war. And that meant stopping all nuclear recycling. Why? Well, you remember the materials that we separated out during the recycling process. One of those materials was plutonium, which is a highly radioactive element that was seen as the highest concern for nuclear proliferation. So President Jimmy Carter...
So plutonium is used in nuclear power plants towards the end of a nuclear fuel cycle in a normal run-of-the-mill pressurized water reactor. Uranium-238, the non-fissile isotope, absorbs a neutron, becomes uranium-239, a couple of beta decays later, and then you have plutonium-239, which is fissile and is used and is fissioned. Nuclear power plants at the end of a fuel cycle actually respond a little faster. They still produce the same amount of power, they're just faster at responding to, say, a control rod insertion, for instance.
Stopped all nuclear recycling, saying, quote, "A viable and economic nuclear power program can be sustained without such reprocessing and recycling." That's
actually true. It can be done. However, the reason why they stopped makes 0 sense. If you get a hand on... Getting your hands on plutonium by itself is not enough to make a nuclear weapon. By that same logic, bleach should be banned because it could be used to make mustard gas, which is far easier to do than making a nuclear bomb with when your only resource is plutonium. You need sophisticated detonation mechanisms. You need the materials to fabricate the bomb. You need an optimized neutron absorber and reflector system to ensure that the bomb won't just fizzle out. It needs to undergo robust testing procedures. All of these things require a considerable amount of resources and infrastructure. So getting your hands on a small sample of plutonium just isn't going to get you there.
The US moved away from the kinds of reactors that could handle nuclear waste, called fast reactors, and toward the kinds of reactors that exist today.
By fast, she's referring to a fast neutron spectrum, and that the neutron is a higher energy level. Fast neutrons do exist in current nuclear reactors in the US, they just don't fission anything. And having fast neutrons, and these fast neutrons can be used in mixed oxide fuel, mixes of uranium and plutonium, mixed carbides, mixed nitrides, even metallic fuels. It just gives you more opportunities to be creative with reactor design. Without using fast neutrons, you're limiting a nuclear engineer in the same way you're limiting a chef, like they can only cook on campfire as opposed to using an actual stove.
Called light water reactors. But while the US stopped nuclear recycling, other countries didn't. The ban on nuclear recycling stopped being seen as helpful to slow the threat of nuclear proliferation. So President Reagan lifted the ban in 1981, but by then, companies had invested in the kinds of reactors that couldn't recycle, the kind that we...
The damage was already done, and this is one of the challenges of investing large-scale production is politicians can change their mind once the wheels are already in motion, and it's sad.
Have now.
Today, the main claim is that nuclear fuel recycling is too high cost. It's just not economical. And that's true compared to using new uranium, which has been cheap and plentiful. What incentive did anyone have to recycle their fuel?
Definitely true in the US. That's why France recycles and the US doesn't, because France didn't have that policy change over many decades.
But those incentives are changing.
The combination of wondering whether global conflict will cut off fuel supply, and the recognition that we need more clean energy in as many ways as possible, as fast as possible, has started to wake people up to a technology and a dream that we'd left behind.
We are not far off from it. We're not talking about a technology that we're dreaming of, that we hope
Yeah, this isn't fusion.
can work. We're talking about technology that has already been demonstrated before and proven. We just need to commercialize it.
There is a lot.
Yeah, fusion, we're trying to tech up to become an advanced civilization. Here, we are scholars in the Dark Ages rediscovering old technology, which is a lot more possible, at least when you look at the physics.
A lot to figure out and a long way to go. But if we can recycle nuclear waste, I think it says something profound about what we as humans are capable of. Splitting atoms, sure, but I mean something much more simple. Changing our minds and overcoming our fears. To use our resources and our technology.
Splitting atoms. The sad part is splitting atoms is super easy compared to overcoming your fear. Also, it's interesting they don't require her to wear a hard hat in the scene.
And our ingenuity to make other people's lives a little bit better tomorrow than they are today.
And this, of course, is just the beginning. Not only will atomic power be released, someday we will harness the rise and fall of the tides and imprison the rays of the sun.
Those, tidal energy, some solar power, though imprison the rays of the sun. He's probably talking about a Dyson sphere, or solar power's final form.
We have indeed just begun.
This video was really good. Thanks again for the recommendation, and thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time.